I moved on her, actually. She was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and fuck her. She was married.
Huge news there.
No, Nancy.
Yeah.
No, this was marriages. And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a bitch, but I couldn't get there. And she was married. Then all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look.
She's your girl's hot as shit. In the purple.
Whoa!
Yes!
Whoa!
Yes, the Donald is good!
Whoa!
That was the famous Access Hollywood tape and Donald Trump talking about sexually assaulting women. This is the Why Now podcast produced by Political Junkie, and I am your co-host, Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil J. Young.
And we are here today with the Bad Guys edition. So today we're going to be talking about a lot of really bad guys. Not that there aren't any bad women we could talk about, but we'll get to that in a future episode. But let's start with the news, Neil. I guess the big news this week, although it's hard to say whether the domestic news or the national news should come first, but the big news this week is that President Donald J. Trump is putting Washington, D.C. under the control of federal troops and police after a former Doge staffer, Edward Corstein, whose nickname online is Big Balls. He's very famous. He worked for Elon Musk, and he's 19 years old. Trump has now declared that because poor Big Balls got mugged in a carjacking, that crime in Washington, D.C. is totally out of control. Trump put the D.C. police under federal jurisdiction, redeployed Secret Service and FBI agents to street patrol, and called in the National Guard. Boom, boom, boom. He also announced plans to round up homeless people, although it's unclear where he plans to take them. As of Thursday night, local authorities had made an extensive effort to move the homeless out of harm's way before the raids began. Neil, are we talking full-on authoritarianism now?
It feels like it. I mean, this is a big, I think Anne Applebaum and a couple of other, scholars of authoritarianism are really pointing to this. I've actually sort of been, in a way, surprised by how important this particular act has been to their ideas of, what it means for us to be in an authoritarian system, and that this is really an important marker of that. And particularly the takeover of a capital by a leader. I know folks that have historians of authoritarianism have spoken out about this. It also seems like the sort of saber rattling, that Trump loves to do, that he can sort of easily marshal federal power behind him to do something that's like this showy, and I think also really plays well on conservative media and with his base. Have you spoken to any of your friends in DC? I have some of my closest friends who live there, and I was just asking them, does it feel palpably different on the ground? And they didn't feel like it was in their areas, but also it does seem like there are visible signs of this that are sort of ready for the cameras, for the Fox News cameras. So I guess it depends, what part of town you're in.
Well, so much of what Trump does, of course, is theater.
Right.
But there are a couple things I picked up from the reporting. One is that these armed police forces of various kinds are mostly in white neighborhoods. They're not in black neighborhoods. And black people who are continually underestimated when it comes to being anti-crime. And so there are a number of people that were being interviewed in black neighborhoods saying, well, we don't see any here. And, we actually have problems with crime too. I think the other thing, and this is kind of an uncomfortable question to ask, Neil, but we're both New Yorkers. You're also an Angelino. It's not as if Washington didn't have a crime problem. And it's not as if Washington didn't have a homeless problem. So how are we as liberals, how should we respond to the fact that these are actually issues?
I think it's a really important question. And I know the Atlantic had a piece out in the last week that was something along the lines of Donald Trump's not wrong about some of the real issues in Washington, D.C., he's just going about it all wrong. And I think that is a hugely important distinction here, that this show of force and the militarization of a city is not the way to address these systemic structural issues. And I think we have a long history and a lot of recent examples that show sort of overused law enforcement power around a lot of these issues isn't something that makes places safer or cleaner or whatever the words you want to use that you would hope a community and a city would be, but in fact actually escalate a lot of those problems, or at least divert resources and attention from more productive ways of doing it. So I think like liberals can acknowledge, and I think they're doing that in a lot of places. Like San Francisco is a good example of a town in which, a left of center mayor, just won that office recently on we got to look at the issues in the city and we got to address them head on. And apparently his approval rating is now in the 70 percentile. And there's sort of real change on the ground happening there. So I think this is going to be actually an interesting question for Democratic leaders in the next couple of years, whether or not to sort of face these issues in these cities and sort of take a different approach to them. That in some ways might be easier to do as Trump seeks to do this particular route.
That's interesting. Can you tell me a little more about that, Neil?
In terms of like the options open to Democrats?
Right.
I mean,
what would make it easier? In the face of this?
I mean, I think if Trump is out there like militarizing a city and taking it over via federal power, does that not give, Democratic mayors of places like Chicago, Los Angeles, other places, sort of the political room to suggest some tactics that like in another age wouldn't be politically as viable, but if it is, we need to do this in order to keep, to stave off Trump's takeover, maybe that becomes maybe the electorate becomes a little bit more open to those things. And I don't necessarily know what those are, but clearly in a lot of places, current strategies are not really working. And I'm just wondering if the sort of threat of Trump and the sort of authoritarian example of him opens up a bit of space politically for other options that wouldn't necessarily be as viable in a different moment.
Right. It's interesting. We should probably do a whole episode on homelessness, but I just want to drop in that the liberal state solution is social work, which I believe in, but also these very sort of time intensive and resource intensive ways of gaining trust in vulnerable populations. And it may well be that we need to think about certain kinds of interventions that were abandoned 50 years ago. I have never believed that people who were mentally ill and florid and living on the street were really in a condition to make good decisions about how they could care for themselves or be cared for by others. And I know that's very controversial. I know we had a long period of mentally ill people being locked up involuntarily forever, and that was wrong. But it seems to me that somewhere in between this kind of authoritarianism, including Trump is saying what he's basing all of this on is Rudolph Giuliani's broken windows policing, which we know was an abject failure in New York. And so on the one hand, we've got his theatricality. On the other hand, we have the liberal state solution, which is you save a few people, but leave the structural problem undisturbed. Often people are homeless because there are no homes they can afford. And Washington, of course, is a primary example of that. Okay, so let's move on to something a little more nostalgic than filling Washington, D.C. with military people. On Monday, CNN reported that AOL is ending dial-up service after 30 years of connecting people. According to the 2023 census, 160,000 Americans still get their internet via modem and landline. But more troubling is that somewhere between 20 and 40 million Americans have no access to broadband at all, which is an affordability problem, but it's also one driven by lack of infrastructure and the absence of competing carriers in rural areas and on tribal lands. So while access to the internet increased dramatically under the Biden administration, one 2023 study shows that 8% of Americans had either no access to the internet at all or accessed it through their phones. First of all, Neil, did you even know that AOL still had dial-up access?
Not at all. I was shocked when I saw this news, and I saw someone, I think it was our friend Natalia Petrozella, say online that she wanted a documentary done about those last users of
Yep.
AOL. Like,
Yep.
what are
That would
their
be
lives
great.
like? How are they using it? I mean, it could be a really fascinating story about the end of what at the time was a huge breakthrough in technology.
Yeah, really amazing. And of course, dial-up is featured in one of my favorite movies, War Games in 1984, in which children almost start a nuclear war over a telephone modem. One of the things that seems to me is an issue here, and if we actually had a good president, and if we actually had a good, FCC chair, they would think about this, is the telephone lines are already in place. You don't have to create new infrastructure for everybody to have access to the internet. And one of the things I've always thought is that simple technologies like dial-up should be available through the post office. Like the post office should take charge of making sure that everybody has access. But anyway, it's
not
sad.
Happening in this administration.
No, it's not. And it's probably not going to happen in any administration. I mean, one of the things that I think the internet has done is it has displaced a range of things that actually are more accessible to poor people and certainly more accessible to the elderly. I don't know how many elderly you have in your life, but my mom really can't do a lot of things on the internet, that things like Social Security and Medicare and so on, that really you can only do on the internet nowadays. Okay, so moving right along, we learned Thursday that Donald Trump plans to celebrate July 4th, 2026 by hosting a UFC cage match fight. I can't believe I'm saying those words. Hosting a UFC cage match fight on the front lawn of the White House. This promotional event benefits at least 2 campaign donors, UFC CEO Dana White and Secretary of Education Linda McMahon, whose WWE franchise owns $50 million worth of stock in the holding company that owns UFC. So I want to ask you 2 questions, Neil. One is this the tackiest thing that ever happened? And the other is, what other presidents can you think of who have done this kind of populist stunt?
Well, is it it's the tackiest thing that's ever happened at the White House since a few weeks before, when the Rose Garden was dug up and paved over. And then did you see those awful picnic tables and umbrellas they put on it? And people are like saying like it's the local, it's your local fast food restaurant. So there's a race of like towards what the next tackiest thing is. But this is going to be hard to trump, to use a word. I also think it ties into our bigger conversation this week about bad guys, because there's something here about featuring wrestling on the White House lawn. Not to say that folks who do this or enjoy it are bad guys, but there's something about the sort of virile masculinity and the theatricality that's associated with this that I think is also relevant to our conversations about what masculinity looks like in this Trump administration and this Trump era. And then what was the second question?
What presidents can you think of? This is sort of a quiz. This is a history quiz. This is your orals coming back to haunt you. What other president, what other can you think of who has sort of invited the people into the White House?
Was there another wrestling match at the White House?
I don't know.
No, okay. I don't
Probably
know.
Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky or something like that. Sorry.
What would be your examples here?
Well, okay. I prepared this because I knew the question in advance. I'm thinking Andrew Jackson bringing that enormous wheel of cheese into the White House, which is probably when the White House developed its mouse problem that it has had ever since as well. But he had this enormous wheel of cheese, and he invited the people to just come to the White House and hack off a chunk of cheese for themselves. That was my example.
I don't know that story. Okay. That's a good one.
Well, there was actually a rather prolonged time when you could just walk into the White House. I mean, it wasn't, I think it was called the Presidential Mansion. It was not yet called the White House, but you could basically just sort of wander in and say like, "Hey, President." And Andrew Jackson encouraged that kind of thing by offering cheese in the front hall. But the other thing I was thinking about, and this wasn't like the people, But do you remember that one of the things that came out during the Teapot Dome scandal in 1924 is not just that Warren Harding had bags of money that were coming into the White House and bootleggers. They had a special White House bootlegger, but that they showed fight films. They showed boxing films in the White House, and boxing films were as illegal as pornography in 1924.
Okay, that must have been what I was thinking of. What about something featuring fighting at the White House?
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, those are two great and really evocative examples. I was trying to think if there's anything like more in our modern age, or really in the like second half of the 20th century that we would count here. But like, then the White House becomes like inaccessible, right? For folks. I mean, like, you know, they're brought in for much more polished and also like, you know, high security events like the Easter egg roll, you know, things like that, which don't have at all the same feel that we're describing here in these other examples that I think UFC will bring to it. Although, I mean, say more about what you think, why you think Trump is doing this.
Well, I think it is both a lavish populist celebration. And of course, it's 2026, so it's going to be the 250th anniversary and so on. And
just telemarket.
Yeah, he's like offering the White House to the people. But I also think what you said earlier that I would like to highlight is the bad guys part, because don't most wrestling matches play out a narrative of good guys and bad guys? Like one team are the good guys and one team are sort of evil and they wear sort of like masks with spikes in them and they cheat and they hit people with chairs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of like polarization of good and evil playing out on the White House lawn is something that MAGA encourages. But I suppose he's not really smart enough to have thought of that by himself.
Yeah.
Right?
I just want to know, is Melania going to be there? Like, can you imagine her sitting there in the hot July sun in like a, I don't know, Christian Dior dress and watching this for an hour and a half?
Well, you know, that's the part I never thought about, Neil, which is this will be in the middle of the summer in Washington, D.C. And that actually sounds like a truly horrible idea. I mean, you know, wrestling matches in Madison Square Garden, at least it's air conditioned, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we'll have to wait and see if this really happens. I think it's one of those things that they're sort of sending out as a trial balloon to see if anybody cares. So let's get to the most important thing that happened in the world this week, which is Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting in Anchorage, Alaska yesterday to discuss ending the war in Ukraine, although they apparently made no progress in ending the war in Ukraine. This summit was thrown together in haste, about 4 days. It was announced on Monday and it happened on Friday. Trump said, clean the red carpet and fly it to Alaska. Trump said that Putin was ready to make a deal, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his European allies were clearly very, very worried about what Trump might do in the middle of this meeting, like, you know, give away all of the Donbass. And they did make it clear that they need to be at the table if there is a lasting and sustainable peace to be achieved. Meanwhile, experts say that the fact that the summit was in Alaska was a victory for Russia, and particularly a victory for Russian nationalists who view Alaska as lost territory. Neil, we're going back to your orals again. Would you please explain to the people why Alaska is lost Russian territory?
Well, because we acquired it from them.
Right.
You know, it also makes me think that back to Sarah Palin and the sort of claims that about why she should, you know, be in the presidential, or why she should be a vice president, that she, as governor of Alaska, could see Russia from her home, or whatever the line was. But
I
let's
can
sort of
see Russia from my house.
Yes. And that was a sort of boast about, you know, knowledge of global affairs and the particular, you know, the particular way in which being governor of Alaska made her like mindful of Russia's presence. But this feels like a huge flip of that, to actually invite that nearby Russia into this area when the conversation is about Russian aggression of Ukraine's land. Also, there's news this morning, just to sort of get to the hastiness of how this was put together, and also the ill preparation that I think we can all assume. There's news this morning that confidential documents were left on a hotel printer. Have you seen this?
Of course they were. No, I haven't seen that.
Yeah,
But
NPR
of
just
course they were.
broke that this morning. And we can imagine that that's just one example of all sorts of things. There's also lots of people freaking out about Putin being inside the president's vehicle.
Right. Right. He probably dropped like an Apple tag under the seat or something like that.
Like, how easy is this?
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So a couple things. One is I was reminded how short Putin is. For a man, Trump isn't very tall. He's about 6'1" or something like that. I know he claims to be 6'4", but he isn't. And Putin is at least 2 heads shorter, which I guess is what happens when you grow up in Stalingrad in World War II or are an orphan on the street or something like that. But he's very short for a very powerful man.
He wears lifts, doesn't he? I mean,
he's still short.
Yeah.
He needs to talk to Ron DeSantis, because actually DeSantis' lifts were a great deal better. I think people are talking about the image of Trump smiling and shaking hands with Putin and Putin smiling back. Reminder, listeners, Putin is an international war criminal and Trump is a felon. So the whole picture is one of the things that I did think was interesting is that Russian nationalists would like Alaska back, and not just Alaska. There's a whole chunk of land all the way down to Northern California that Russians colonized, hence in Northern California, the Russian River, and so on and so forth. And they were fur trappers, and they ended up selling it to William J. Seward in 1967 for $7 million because they were so in debt from the Crimean War. So there are all sorts of interlocking historical facts here. But the main point is there does not seem to have been any progress made on Ukraine. And I want to just ask you about this thing of what the haste that this was put together in. Why should that matter to Americans? Why is that a sort of weird way for an American president to do business?
Well, I think, an international summit, particularly in our day and age, needs all sorts of security preparations before you enter into it.
Right.
And I don't think anyone believes that 4 days are enough preparation for that. Right. I also think that there's something about this that just feels like the way Trump operates in general, which is like a whim of an idea comes into his head and then he, gets everyone to make it happen. And that's, of course, by his supporters, treated as like him as a good leader, able to get things done. But of course, it's not at all about that. It's about his just sort of inconsistent mind and the way that he's sort of just follows every flight of fancy.
Right.
So, I mean, those are the things that feel really relevant about the hastiness of this. Also, it doesn't, as we see with Ukraine, it doesn't really seem like an important ally was at all aware of what was happening here, kept abreast of developments, or at all included in the preparation for this. And that doesn't seem like a good way for us to act on the international stage. What other things would you include in that?
Well, a couple things. Now, Trump is going to meet with Zelensky on Monday. I don't know whether that's a Zoom meeting, whether he will bring Zelensky or Zelensky will fly to Washington or what's going on. It staggers me the way these guys fly around the globe. I really couldn't do it. But the other thing I'm thinking about is I thought it was standard operating procedure for foreign policy that when you have a summit of world leaders, there are teams that hash things out in advance and settle on one positive outcome that's going to come from this. And so that regardless of what happens at the summit, everybody gets to walk out and say, we're still talking about Ukraine, but we are happy to say that we have come to an agreement that Vladimir Putin will not invade the Baltic states. or something like that. You are supposed to have something that shows that you are effective, that this is a relationship, and that there are grounds for continuing the conversation. This seemed to me like having a conversation with a senior thesis student who is telling you in February that they're almost finished when in fact they've barely begun the research. So probably an odd analogy. But those are the things that occur to me. I don't think anything is going to happen on Ukraine anytime soon. And of course, it's in Putin's interest to simply drag this out as finally, after 1 million casualties, he is making some incremental progress in the eastern part of Ukraine.
And Putin wouldn't have agreed to this if he didn't see some advantage in it. So I think that that's all the more relevant here if, as you've said, we can't point to any real outcome of this. There may be no outcome of this that looks like what one would sort of a traditional summit would generate, but Putin didn't walk into this to get nothing out of it. Right. Whether it's, dropping a recording device in the presidential car or creating some sort of nationalist moment for Russian media by just being on American soil. He is a strategic mastermind and an evil genius and would not be doing this if he didn't see an opportunity for some sort of advantage here.
Totally agree. And, even you and I, Neil, could do the spycraft here. I mean, it doesn't have to be an Apple tag. It could be, oh, here, Donald, you have forgotten your pen? Take my pen. This is a special pen given to me by Stalin. And, Trump would wear it around and then get targeted by something. So yeah, I mean, it's absurd. And I think your point about Putin being a strategic genius and brilliant, that's just true. And Trump isn't. Right. Exactly. And one of his great weaknesses is his vanity. He doesn't know that he isn't a strategic genius.
But Putin does.
But Putin does.
And also knows he's vain, right? So it's
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Final addendum to all of this is one of the announcements Trump made was that the United States was the greatest power in the world and Russia was the second greatest power. And I'm like, call Xi Jinping because I think he would beg to differ. Anyway, so let's get to today's focus. This is a fun focus. Fun because it's ugly and florid and tacky. We're beginning with Florida Republican security entrepreneur and Congressman Cory Mills. And we're going to use that, Neil, to then have a wider conversation about something I've been thinking about for a while, which is why Donald Trump's Republican Party is filled with such unbelievably bad, nasty men. Cory Mills is a member of the House of Representatives representing Florida 07, a district just north of Orlando, which is kind of near where you live in Florida, right?
Very near. And in fact, when I was growing up, Florida 07 included the Maitland Winter Park area, which is where I'm from, the northern suburbs of Orlando. It was redistricted in, I believe, within the last 10 years or so. And so now the place I'm from and where all my family is Florida 10.
Okay.
But yeah, his district is right above now the one where I grew up.
Okay, so Cory Mills was born in Winter Haven, not Winter Park. There must be lots of towns in that area that begin with the name Winter.
Yes, Winter Haven is actually south of Orlando.
Okay.
All of circling Orlando are Winter Park, Winter Haven, Winter Springs, Winter Garden. You get the theme.
Yes, exactly.
Winter Haven was a famous orange growing community, and now is, I think, mostly retirees. But was the heart of Orange County, of Orange Country, when I was growing up.
Right. Okay. So Winter Haven, absent oranges now and full of the elderly. That's where Mills was born, and he served with the 82nd Airborne in Iraq. He also served briefly in Yugoslavia, I think, in 1999. Following his service, Mills worked for a series of military contractors before starting his own private security company, which appears to have done millions of dollars of government-approved business with the government of Iraq. But apparently Iraq got sort of suspicious about what was happening to their money and they cut it off. There's some kind of investigation there. In 2022, on the strength of all this money, Mills flipped a Democratic seat and, upon arriving in Washington, distinguished himself by handing out souvenir grenades with a GOP logo on them to his new colleagues. And I remember this, Neil, because there was some question at the beginning as to whether they were real grenades or not. Like,
Yes.
Was he walking around with live grenades in Congress? He also immediately sponsored a House resolution to impeach President Biden, along with Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia 14, over what they claimed was Biden's mishandling of immigration at the U.S.-Mexico border. Mills also seems to have separated from his wife around this time. Now, this is where our story truly begins, from whom he is not yet divorced. So, Neil, why are we talking about Cory Mills today?
Well, I mean, you've set up a lot of the reasons why he's worth talking about. But to add to that, there are all sorts of allegations about him being involved in domestic abuse, having had domestic abuse issues with one of his lovers, who is apparently living in a penthouse apartment in Washington, D.C., who is the current Miss United States. I may be sort of getting some of the facts wrong here, because there's so many different scandals he has going on, and they involve
and a lot of women, as it turns out.
And they involve more than one woman. So I may not be getting the details of each particular affair correct, but there's a lot of that sort of news around him, and to the extent that like Republicans are nervous about, because I think there's been a couple of like Democrats who've already signaled they're going to challenge him, and he's not doing well in polling back in Florida 07. So Republicans worry that this is a vulnerable seat, and also just that there's like more corruption stories that are about to be exposed.
Right. So the girlfriend who sort of brought this all to light is a woman named Lindsay Langston. And you are correct. She is the reigning Miss United States. And in fact, she's competing in Miss Universe in November. And at the same time, she's a Florida State Republican committee member. So there are lots of intersecting themes here. I would have to say she seems like a very courageous person. Cory Mills, she broke up with Cory when she discovered, after the domestic abuse thing came out in February, that there was another woman entirely in Washington, D.C., who's a political consultant that he was dating just as seriously as he was dating her. And as I understand it, with Langston, there was an engagement ring.
Mm.
But he was also saying to all of these women, you must never post a picture of me online. Yes, I'm already divorced from my wife, but you must never post a picture of me online. And apparently Lindsay once put up a picture like of their feet. They were on the beach and took a picture of their feet, which is something people do for reasons I don't quite understand. And he was like, no, you have to take that down.
Wow.
And so she's not dumb. And when the domestic abuse thing came out, she was like, I'm not doing this. She broke up with him. He began to stalk her. He threatened her. He threatened anyone she might date in the future physically. But here's one of the things that I think is both so banal when we're talking about the modern Republican Party and so awful. He has been a staunch anti-pornography advocate in the House. He voted for the Take It Down Act, which was a law saying that if anybody can have their image taken down if they ask for it to be taken down, which is a huge problem at places like Pornhub, revenge porn sites, that, somebody puts your image up and you can't get it down. He voted for that law. And he said he would release nude images and videos of Lindsay Langston if she didn't get back together with him. What a way to court a girl. And as it turns out, and here's another interesting twist, Langston is being represented by Anthony Sabatini, who Mills defeated in the 2022 primary. Neil, what are we supposed to make of how bad this man is?
Yeah. Is it all surprising at this point?
He's so bad.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like this stuff with the pornography and his own threats of releasing revenge porn is an interesting political example of hypocrisy. But even pointing out hypocrisy at this point in American politics feels like a fool's errand. Like, what's the point of even saying that? Yeah, he's a really, really bad guy. It's also worth remembering it wasn't that long ago that very mild behavior would bring about a censure by Congress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or actually pressure to step down from your seat.
Right.
We are so far away from that political reality that was only a handful of years ago. And I think that's maybe the heart of the conversation here today around this topic of like, how are we here and why is this? I mean, this guy is a horrible person, but I'm not sure he's that much of an outlier of Republicans in politics, not necessarily because they're like him and doing the same things, but because this behavior is sort of part and parcel of the larger Republican Party's like way of being in this world.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, and their leader, of course, their dear leader is Donald Trump, who does all of these things, sleeps around, brags about it, rapes women. It is said that he raped and physically assaulted his first wife, Ivana. She, in fact, said he had done that, and then she recanted it right before she signed the divorce decree and got her money and was able to leave him. And I think the physical violence of these men is, particularly stands out to me. Mills, of course, says none of these things happened. And the February thing, which was a political consultant, her name is Sarah Raviani, she called the police and said Cory Mills had assaulted her. But then she recanted and she didn't file charges. And when you look at what Mills has done to Lindsay Langston, you think, well, I can think of lots of reasons that a political consultant wouldn't want a sex tape circulating around Washington of her, right? So what were the circumstances of her recanting is particularly ugly. Apparently, Mills has tons and tons of money and is prone to extravagant behavior. I listened to a podcast yesterday by Ryan Gerdusky, who's also a political consultant. He interviewed somebody. And according to him, one of his friends was dating Mills. And the first date is incredibly lavish and, involves helicopters and expensive bottles of champagne, these sort of $10,000, $15,000 first dates, sort of love bombing things, after which he becomes extremely controlling. But I think what you're saying, Neil, which is it wasn't so long ago before this kind of behavior would have, at very basic, been worthy of a censure and perhaps of a resignation. I want to suggest, and see what you think about this, that Matt Gaetz was kind of a pivot point here. What do you think?
yeah, I think he's definitely part of this trajectory, right? Because he's probably the first or the earliest example we have in the sort of Trump era of this sort of stuff being really publicly revealed and there being no consequence of it.
Right.
But I think that like the bigger context here is Trump, right? Like all of this happens, I think, only because Trump is the head of the Republican Party. I mean, does Matt Gaetz keep his congressional office, his congressional seat, if, someone like Mitt Romney is the leader and the face of the Republican Party, or like any other sort of person we would imagine, might have been the president, a John McCain type or anyone. So Trump is the absolute, important context here of all of this behavior being permitted because, of course, it can't be questioned. It can't be. I mean, you can imagine a different political reality, actually, in which folks like this have to be the sacrificial lambs on behalf of Trump. But that's just not how it's played out, because I think the culture has shifted in a way that none of this matters. I just still come back to this. I'm actually writing this essay. And one of the things that I want to remind readers of is like the first thing Trump said when he was running in 2015, 2016, which is, I could walk into Fifth Avenue and shoot someone in the face and no one would care. I'm paraphrasing there.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the truest thing he's ever said.
Right.
And therefore, an entire culture, an entire political party was changed around this guy's, abject amorality.
Right. Well, and it's like on the one hand, we have bad men doing bad things with impunity and sometimes with the collaboration of women. I mean, Cory Mills is doing all these things. Pam Bondi is sitting on her fat ass at Donald Trump's right hand, worried about whether there are a few homeless people sitting on the steps of Union Station.
Right.
So it's kind of like, Pam, something's happening.
While she's also bearing the Epstein,
right,
investigation.
Exactly. So on the one hand, it's like, these are just bad, bad, bad people. And then on the other hand, there is a new tactic, which is to simply say it didn't happen. Now, we have to be honest here. There are a range of Democrats who've done the same thing. I remember watching Bill Clinton on television. I was sitting in my living room in Middletown, Connecticut, watching him give a press conference, and he looked in the camera and said, "I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." And I thought, oh, fuck, you did. I mean, it's just, nobody would say that in that way without actually being guilty of that thing. So I knew he was lying. We know that John F. Kennedy, had sex with women, not his wife, 2 or 3 times a day in the White House swimming pool, for crying out loud. So it's not like Democrats are innocent of these things, but it is remarkable to me how much the Republican playbook is now, you hide things until you can't hide them anymore. When you can't hide them anymore, you simply say it didn't happen. If that doesn't work, you say it's a political attack, which is why the Anthony Sabatini thing is so interesting. I don't know why she hired the person who ran against Mills in the primary, but she did. So you can always find something that makes that a little bit credible to the MAGA faithful.
I also think there's a couple more stages of that trajectory or that development that you're talking about, which is the third step is if it did happen, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And the last step is it did happen, and I'm proud of it, or it's a good thing it did. I mean, that has
what
been
a guy.
Yes, exactly. That has been the 4-stage development of every sort of scandal, every sort of bad thing that has happened in the Trump age, because that's his playbook.
Right.
It goes from a denial to ultimately a boast.
Right.
And I think your examples about have political leaders not been faithful to their wives? Yes. And also that's not what these examples are really about.
Right. Right.
So, but I also think that there's something so interesting. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and I've often thought I want to sort of write about this, but to think about the last 20 to 30 years of conservatism, and particularly the sort of models of masculinity and manhood that have changed over that 2 to 3 decades. I mean, I think we're 25 years out from the sort of George W. Bush, servant's heart masculinity, right? Remember that?
Right.
And the sort of soldier, the honorable soldier. I don't mean a military person, but that honorable servant. That these were the examples of masculinity that conservatives were giving the culture, right? Fathers, husbands, providers.
Right.
I mean, this is where I think the UFC, the wrestling match thing is really important here.
It's very interesting you're saying that, because I saw on Instagram the other day some Instagram account that's associated with the GOP posted a picture of Tim Tebow, the athlete, with his infant child. Yeah, and on the computer. Right. This NFL legend is showing what fatherhood looks like. And I thought, well, except actually he was a failure as an NFL player and as a Major League Baseball player. So, and that's sort of typical of that kind of propaganda. Is there's something actually quite nice about a father holding his child, and kind of sweet, but they can't leave it there. He's got to be an NFL legend.
Right.
which he was not. Now, I just want to kind of overwhelm you and our listeners with a list that I compiled that I think is totally incomplete. But since 2017, when Trump took office, 8 high-profile Republicans have been accused of physically or sexually assaulting someone. Greg Gianforte, Curtis Hill, Aaron von Ellinger, Tom Reed, Matt Schlapp. He's a good one. He's like in your wheelhouse, Neil. Rob Porter, and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Then there's Corey Lewandowski, who works for Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem. Both of them are married, and Lewandowski has been credibly accused of physically assaulting someone at a Trump campaign rally and physically assaulting a woman in Las Vegas at a casino. I guess he thought that the women were there because they wanted to be pawed by him. Then we have porn and the trafficking of teenagers. On beyond Epstein, we could have called this issue. Matt Gaetz, obviously, Donald Trump, but also Oklahoma State Senator Ralph Shorty, Pennsylvania State Senator Mike Fulmer, and Arizona State Representative Dave Stringer. All of those people have been implicated in the trafficking of underage people. Most recently, South Carolina Republican R.J. May, a member of the state legislature representing Lexington County, South Carolina, has resigned after accusations that he shared child pornography videos on the social messaging app Kik. Now, this is the best part. Under the username Joe Biden. Okay?
That's an image.
I mean, it's just like, it's so bananas. And he's in jail. The judge basically said, no, you're staying in jail until you get tried. We're not letting you out. But it's not, Neil, I'm thinking back to your book, Coming Out Republican, and there were so many closeted gay men who were political operatives. And yet it seems like a relatively minor piece of hypocrisy compared to actively committing crimes and victimizing people that you claim your party wants to defend.
Exactly. And I think like that laundry list in itself is like stunning and deserves like scrutiny, but all the more so in our particular political era in which the politics or the discourse of grooming has been one of the biggest driving strategies of the GOP for the last, 2 election cycles. So like how do we reconcile these things, or how do we like think about these things together, that you have a political witch hunt, or you have these like scare tactics that are enormously effective and turning up voters to vote against the fear that like their children are being groomed, and also you have so many of those same legislators in Washington who are doing the very things that, these conservative activists are warning, Americans that they're public school teachers, or they're, the drag story hours at the library are going to do to their children. Like, how do we talk about those things together?
Well, one of the ways I've been thinking about it, and I don't know whether this totally addresses the question you're asking, is that actually none of these Republican policies, that they're cynical about the policies themselves. And we sort of know that. I mean, we know, for example, that the fear of transgender people was whipped up in order to terrify people that, their children were going to go to school and come home as another sex. But that actually all of these people know that these policies don't matter and they aren't important. I would also say, in terms of the child pornography stuff, it's a huge business, and it's a huge business that is actually implicated in, I think, larger financial structures. And I'm not talking about, the global conspiracy of whatever. I'm talking about, companies like, Viacom is heavily invested in pornography. And even though adult pornography sites in general work hard to keep the kiddie porn stuff out, they're not very successful at it. They're not successful, and they don't even try. Like Pornhub didn't even try for years and years and years to verify that most of the videos that were uploaded with the consent of the person in them. And women tried for decades to try and get these things taken down, and it didn't work. So I think there are a lot of these people who are in the bag for media companies who actually care about these things as well. And I think that might be the badness under the badness. But I also think these are men who are basically without any kind of moral center. I mean, that to me is part of what it means to continue supporting Donald Trump, say, if you are a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the only takeaway, I think, when you describe all these different folks and all the accusations against them. And also, we're in a moment in which moral politics and a politics of moralism is raging again on the right.
Right.
And, I sort of asked that question, like, how do we reconcile it? And I think, like, that's the answer is you don't. Like, that these actually work together.
Right.
And perhaps they work especially together in a social media age that has disrupted traditional media and has like atomized everyone's, individual experience of sort of politics and media and culture. I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm raising more questions than answering, but I think it just speaks to like we're in the midst of a sort of tidal change here of like culture, politics, and notions of gender, sexuality, and manhood. None of these folks are good. And I think that's like the more important thing here is just sort of like the real bottom of the barrel sort of folks who are the ones that are really rising to leadership, power, and influence on the right, and have thoroughly changed the Republican Party.
Yeah. And that the Department of Justice, at least for the next 2.5 years, 3.5 years, is not going to take any interest in prosecuting.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it is people who are bad to begin with have come to realize that they can be as bad as they want. I mean, I'm surprised that George Santos isn't still in Congress, and he probably isn't in Congress because it was the Biden administration, right? And, will he get out and try to run again? Maybe. And, and he's the sort of paradigm, or I don't know, the extreme of this, because he's actually actively delusional. Most of these guys are not delusional. They just don't care.
Yeah.
Okay, Neil. So let's return to this topic in the future, because I think there's going to be more to talk about. But right now, I want to talk about what you want to go viral this week.
Yeah, I'm just turning to my podcast app to make sure I get this title correctly.
Okay.
I thought it was right. Yes. So I want to talk about this new podcast that just dropped, I think really quite recently. It's called Liberty Lost.
Okay.
It's only about 7 episodes. I've listened to 5, so I'm almost done with it. And I raced through those 5. I mean, I listened to them in the last 2 days. So high recommend from me. Liberty Lost is about what is called the Liberty Godparent Home. Liberty, as in Liberty University, Jerry Falwell. So this is a podcast series about this maternity home.
Wow.
That is on the campus of Liberty University that was begun back in the 1970s after the legalization of abortion with Roe v. Wade. Obviously, Jerry Falwell becomes a huge political player around the anti-abortion movement and using the politics of abortion to make himself into this national political figure. And also one of the things that he did, because of course the argument that the anti-adoption or movement was making was like, babies shouldn't be aborted, they should be adopted. And if we believe in this politics, we need to create systems and structures that make adoption easier. And so a lot of energy, a lot of money, and I, grew up in evangelical background. So I remember this from, the 1980s of like, our church giving lots of money to like the local maternity home that was helping like unwed teenagers, carry their babies to term. So like that was a huge development in the history of evangelical politics, evangelical culture in the US in the 80s and 90s. But this focuses on the particular example of the Liberty Home that Falwell ran. And it really mostly focuses on this one particular couple, and their story is heartbreaking. I mean, it is absolutely devastating. This young teenage girl who grew up in a homeschooling, traditional, like really, really conservative. I mean, this is actually fundamentalist Christianity that we're talking about in this particular example. And as conservative as an evangelical background I have, whenever I am looking at materials or subject matter that's about fundamentalist Christianity, I recognize the gulf between conservative evangelicalism and its fundamentalist sort of wing. Anyway, there's lots to be said here. I'll just really recommend people listen to this podcast. My one kind of complaint or critique is that it doesn't really have much of a historical angle to it, or it doesn't really grapple with history. It really sort of focuses on more contemporary examples and just sort of makes some nodding references to the longer history. I think you could do an amazing historical treatment of this, but it's a fascinating and heartbreaking story. And of course, these women are exploited. Basically, it's a baby factory to get white babies into conservative Christian homes who want to adopt. And the young unwed women who go to this place are incredibly poorly treated and really abused. And it's a heartbreaking story about that. But highly recommend people listen to it. And I am eager to finish it. But yeah, it's a great listen.
Sounds wonderful. I am about to go on vacation and I will download this immediately. You're talking about the long history, Neil. I think one book our listeners might be interested in, I can't remember the title, but it's written by Regina Kunzel, who's a historian at Yale. And she wrote a history of homes for unwed mothers. So coercion of unwed mothers used to be the norm. And that is, clearly being maintained and amplified in this day and age, particularly with these services that sort of claim to be maternal health services, but actually they're recruiting you to help you have your baby so it can go to an adoption agency and so on. Thank you, Neil. That sounds wonderful and very timely. So what I want to go viral this week is an article in the New York Times I read by Caroline Kitchener, and Kitchener is her name. And the Times is doing all of these pieces about new kinds of communities. They did one on a group of women in Texas who have decided to age out together. They did another one that was, what was it about? Anyway, this is about a group of Maha moms who purchased a farm and have built houses all over the farm. And they are raising their children on organic vegetables and, not being vaccinated, the whole Maha agenda. But what's interesting about it is that it is an intentional community in which, and, I'm old enough to remember those intentional communities where everybody went back to the land and farmed and canned and wove and sewed and blah, blah, blah. These people hire other people to do that. So it's sort of like a version of what a lot of wealthy people did during the pandemic, which the article doesn't make the connection to that. But remember all of those people who went to their country houses and then you could call a service and you could get chickens delivered and the children could have chickens and eggs and stuff like that. Well, this is it, but it's an intentional community in which everybody is living near each other. So all the people have the same values you do, but everybody is just stinking rich. And I think it's definitely worth reading for a couple of reasons. One is that this whole idea of the Maha mom sort of gets defined in the articles. What does that mean to make America healthy again? And the point is, it is a form of extreme individualism that activates itself in the desire to be healthy and well. And who doesn't want to be healthy and well, right?
Sure.
That's really important. But what's also important is it sort of underlines why the Maha agenda can't, in fact, be national policy without other kinds of things coming into play.
Sure.
Like you can't have organic vegetables unless somebody is willing to grow them for you. And when they do that, it's expensive. It's not the same as going to Stop and Shop and getting things that have been harvested by machine from Chile and so on and so forth. So I'm recommending everybody read this. It's interesting about the Maha moms. It's interesting about intentional community and interesting about what I think is kind of a turning point in our history as a nation where people long for community, but often the communities they're choosing then cut them off from other people.
Yeah. That looks so interesting. I have the Texas article bookmarked. I've been wanting to read that because I'm constantly dreaming about my retirement days. But yeah, this one sounds really, really important to read as well.
Well, and the Texas article is really interesting because a lot of those women are women who have worked all of their lives and they don't, throw in a link to it for our readers. But they've worked for all of their lives and they don't have enough money to retire. So what they do is they buy these trailers and tiny houses and put them on the land that this other woman bought. But they also have really different politics from each other, which means that nobody's allowed to have political conversations. They can't actually talk about politics because they know perfectly well that they will all disagree. And if they disagree, the community might break apart, as opposed to the community in Ohio where you don't show up in the first place unless you have these values, right?
Wow.
Okay, Neil. So my value is seeing you every week.
Same. Back at you.
And the next time I see you, I'll be on Martha's Vineyard.
Lucky you.
Canceling Alan Dershowitz at the pierogi stand. And that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads at Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe to Why Now on your favorite podcast platform. Please leave a rating and a comment so other listeners can find us. Why Now is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers to Political Junkie. Why Now and Political Junkie are written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is by Tiger Gang. You can find their work on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.